Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Symposium. Let's adapt our services to the diversity of survivors. It is organized by the West Island CALACS. So the West Island CALACS, if you are unaware, it's a sexual assault center for women. And I am the project manager. And for this month, so we have a series of 6 amazing webinars for you. So I will be the host. And today we have, actually the webinar is a keynote speech by the amazing artist, activist, Shanice Nicole. So we'll have a speech. We have some poems and stories for you as well. And then we'll have a discussion together. So the webinar, just to remind you, it's titled Beyond Inclusion, Reframing Support for Survivors. So before we add on, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. So the symposium takes place on unceded indigenous lands, the island called Montreal, known as Jojage, and the language of Ganegehaga Nation is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. As an organization that centers social justice and intersectional feminism, we think that it's crucial to be informed about the past and ongoing consequences of colonialism. So I encourage everyone to educate themselves, learn about the history of these lands, and support Indigenous resistance. I think that for me, it's important to start each webinars with the land acknowledgement to just remind ourselves that we live on a land that was stolen and that doesn't belong to us. And as I think that everyone here who attends the webinar is working in a field where we help people, we want to support people and accompany them through tough times. And I think it's important to reflect on what Indigenous communities need and support, and we must fight alongside of them. So today our webinar, the discussion that we're going to have, me and Shanice, will reflect back on what happened in 2020. So I encourage everyone to reflect on 2020, especially related to Indigenous communities, such as at the beginning of 2020 with the Wet'suwet'en people fighting for their lands and water, the tragic death of Jos Echequan, and the violence and vandalism experienced by the Mi'kmaq fishers and Nova Scotia. So those are not isolated events. So I just wanted to start with that. Shanice Nicole is a Black feminist, educator, facilitator, writer, and outspoken word artist. A debut children's book, Dear Black Girls, published by Metonymy Press, is now available for pre-order, and she is also a curator for free community resources such as Job and Things, All Black Everything in Montreal, and the BFCN Scholarship Directory. Shanice Nicole believes that everyone has the power to make changes and dreams of a freer world for us all. Thank you, Shanice, for being here. We'll start with the speech. I don't know if you want to start with the poem or the speech, just as you wish.
Thank you so much, Tarah. We're actually going to start with the poems.
Okay.
And then we'll transition into the speech, and then we'll have time to chat together, which I'm most excited about.
Me too.
So thank you so much. Merci tout le monde, everyone, for being here. I'm so grateful, and thank you to everyone as well who popped in the chat some things that you're expecting for today. I think our discussion is going to be really exciting, and for me, as always, is just like a starting point or the tipping point of the conversation that needs to be ongoing and continue. And so I'm also excited that there is a whole host of workshops and webinars to come throughout this week so that people can continue to explore these themes. And then, of course, beyond. And as always, please take what you learn and bring it back to your people, as I like to say, your communities, because that's the way the learning happens. And it has to be a shared and collective process. So I'm just so grateful to be here. So I'm going to start with some poetry. Of course, there's, I want to say, obviously, a massive content /trigger warning for like the theme of this week, but that is also going to be kind of threaded throughout my poetry. So discussions of sexual violence and harm and consent. And so with the poetry, with anything that I'm sharing today, with anything that anyone will be sharing today, please, I invite you to take care of yourselves in whatever ways that you can. And I think we're sometimes more easily able to do that in this virtual context. But I invite you to please do what you need to be as well as possible in this space. And if at any point I'm speaking too quickly for the interpreters, please let me know, as I tend to be a fast talker. So I'll start with some poetry. I'm going to take a breath. So I'll invite you to also take a breath in case you've been holding your breath today or this week or the past 9 months, maybe.
Yeah.
Shake out those shoulders. Okay. So this first poem is called Maya's Voice, and I wrote it in honor of one of my favorite poets, Miss Maya Angelou, and she rests in power. When Maya Angelou was 8, she stopped speaking. And not because there were no words to speak, but because she believed that her words were not meant to be spoken. So she turned off her voice, a conscious choice after not being given one. Because at 8, Maya Angelou was raped. And she used her voice to voice her truth. And that man, well, he went to jail for a day. Turns out he was murdered a few days after by men who believed that he had to pay for his crime beyond doing 24 hours of time inside. But this is not a poem about how the criminal and justice system is broken or, as they say, working the way it's supposed to. This is a poem about voice. This is a poem about how nobody on this planet is voiceless, but how so many on this planet have their voices taken away. This is a poem about how Black children have to learn how to fight to survive, even before learning how to spell the word. This is a poem about Black women being told, this is a poem about Black women carrying burdens too big for our shoulders and still being told to stand up straight, even when the weight breaks our backs and shatters our spines. No more, no more, no more. We deserve more than to just survive, so enough with the pain, enough with the violence, and whether you sit in silence or shout from the tops of every mountain and roof, know that whatever you choose is your choice. Know that whatever you choose is your right. Thank you. That's the first poem.
Thank you so much. It's an amazing poem. Mm-hmm. Just as a side note, it's so 2 years ago, the West Island CALACS produced an awareness video. It was a spoken word video with Black and racialized women talking about sexual violence, and Shanice Nicole was one of the artists there, and that was the poem that was performed, and on the video online. It's on our YouTube page if you want to see the video again. It's amazing. But thank you so much. It's so powerful. I just see the comments. It's very powerful, and it's still powerful now, and it still talks. I think it resonates even more now as it resonated before. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This is the second poem. This one is still untitled. And it's brand new, so no one has heard it or experienced it, as I like to say. Okay, another breath. They call us survivors, but what if we didn't? I mean, what if we're technically still alive but don't feel like we survived? Yes, our lungs are still breathing air, and yes, out of our body still grows hair, but what about the parts of us that didn't make it? That didn't grow back? That didn't continue to inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, following the rhythm of yet another breathing exercise designed to soothe and regulate? But what about the parts of us that cannot be contained? What about the parts that remain untamed, eating away at our insides, bleeding outside, spilling onto the ground beneath our feet, sometimes with sound, sometimes with silence? Where is the room for our stories that do not fit your scripts? So often designed without many of us in mind, written as if we are all one, as if we are all the same, as if by chance we just happen to become 1 in 5, or is it 1 in 3? Doesn't even matter. The discrepancy, a false sense of unity, because there is nothing unifying about surviving the undignifying act of violation. Because our mere survival is not worthy of celebration when the same structures and cultures that enabled the harm to remain strong and intact, leaving bodies behind in their wake, bodies that are forced to find a way to continue to breathe, to grow, to live, to survive. And that too sometimes feels like a violation. To still be here, and to be reminded that we should be grateful for surviving a story that never should have been written to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm a bit speechless right now.
That's why I'm going to go into the speech, and so we can have a minute to just, be in your body or not. Leave your body if you need to, because that's also sometimes a thing, So thank you so much for allowing me to share those with you. And I wish we were in a room and there was coffee and wine and good cheese and all of those things. But, one day in the future. I'm going to transition now into a speech. It's really a short speech. It's just opening up the conversation that I'm really excited to have with Tarah after. And then we want to really invite your participation, your questions, your reflections, the things that you're experiencing and thinking through in your work or in your own personal contexts. And also, I hope that this is kind of an opening and almost like an overview of what's to come for the week, because I think what's really exciting is that people are going to dig a little deeper and dive into some more specific topics. And I think that will be great opportunities for everyone to kind of continue that learning, as I said. So good afternoon. Thank you for being here, for showing up. I hope you are sitting somewhere comfortable and warm, under a blanket and with a cup of tea or whatever it is that you like surrounding you. My name is Shanice Nicole, as has been mentioned, and I'm so grateful to be joining you all, even in this virtual context that we, have intimately become familiar with over the past almost year now. But also many people have been familiar, connecting in this virtual way prior to the time of COVID. So I think that's also just really something interesting to reflect on, like what are the ways that we get to connect with each other and to be in community. And so I want to thank, of course, the West Island CALACS for organizing this important series of webinars, for all of the work that has gone into this process, especially thinking about, how we do connect with each other in ways that feel good and are affirming and are also accessible. I just want to say thank you so much to all of the interpreters and the team who's doing work kind of behind the scenes and on the scenes. We had a brief check-in just before this, and it's just such a reminder as to all of the logistics and elements that are important for us to consider and sometimes that we don't consider. And for me, it was really just an important reminder to sit and witness that process and to be reminded of like the effort and labor that needs to go into our organizing, because everyone deserves to have access. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like kind of in practicality. But I just want to say thank you for that labor that often goes unseen and makes it possible for us to show up and to connect. I also want to express gratitude to the Ginengahaga people of the surrounding territory for their lifetimes of care of this land and all that it provides. As a Black woman whose grandparents and ancestors were forced to leave their homes and find new ones elsewhere, I think often about my responsibility as someone who now calls Jojage home. So what is my responsibility to this land? And what is my responsibility to the original people of this land? And I think that is an important reflection for each of us, regardless of our own stories of how we arrived here. And I also believe that this sense of responsibility and care is necessary for our collective survival, of course, but also the work that still needs to be done to achieve collective thrival, and that we are far from. And I do believe in my heart and in my spirit that when we choose care, we resist the legacy and the teachings of colonialism. For at its root, colonialism is a deep, deep form of violence and violation. So how can we choose care? And how can we choose each other? So the title of my talk kind of today is Beyond Inclusion, Reframing Support for Survivors. And I wanted to explore this theme because inclusion is often framed as the goal or even the bar. But what we must remember is that inclusion is in fact the bare minimum, right? Inclusion is the bare minimum. And the significant flaw of the theory of inclusion is that it doesn't actually challenge the power structures that create inequity, right? So nothing is challenged simply by including people. What inclusion allows for is it simply permits those who already have a key to unlock a door and allow others to enter. And so that's what I mean by it's the bare minimum, right? We're using a key that we already have to open a door that already exists and to let people in. And so we need to question who gets a copy of that key and who gets to decide who comes through the door, who is deemed worthy, and who is deemed not. And connecting to that is something I always like to say, which is not only is it important for us to question who is or isn't at the table. So we often talk about this metaphorical table or sometimes an actual kind of table. So it's not just who is at the table or who isn't at the table, but we also need to question the table itself. Like we actually need to question the table itself, like that structure, right? We need to question the myth that there is one place or one way that change can happen, or one place or one way where power is exchanged. And that questioning requires an entire reframing to how we typically engage in this work, which often is in a way that centers the table, right? We have to get around the table to do the work. At the table is where the decisions are made. At the table is where power is shared or exerted. But I really want us to think about questioning that table. And what would that look like in the work that we do, whether it's, again, in our individual lives, personally, or professionally. And I think this, again, questioning is needed because we need to shift and expand our perspective and by extension, our practices. And the perspective has to come first. I think often we jump to shifting our practices without actually sitting with our perspectives and thinking through, why is it that I think in this particular way, or why is it that I question or don't question in this particular way, before we jump into wanting to fix, problems that are older than us by generations, right? So I think there's a humility there that really has to be tapped into, especially if we are aiming for cultural and systemic change, right? Cultures and systems are built and designed and then built and then developed and strengthened over centuries, over generations. And so I think it's especially important that we, again, practice that humility in our attempts to make those shifts. I'm especially thinking right now about all of the energy and passion that was displayed this summer, particularly after the murder of George Floyd. And there was this real yearning and interest to fix the problem. And as someone who does anti-racism work, it was really interesting to just like take a minute to stop and pause and witness what was happening around me. And what I realized was there was like this deep kind of yearning and interest to fix the problem by Monday. And it was a good reminder for me, okay, how this work actually happens. And it's not sprint work, it's marathon work, right? And it requires us to come back to and to return to it often. But I can understand when you are, smacked in the face with the reality of harm or violence, we want the fix, we want the change to be instantaneous. We want it to happen overnight. But that is unfortunately not possible. Because it would have been done, right? It would have been done. We would have been in that place of collective thrival. And so I think it's so important, even when we are in it and we are, literally our blood, our sweat, our tears are going into this work to make that change. We also have to remember, like, what are the structures that we're working within? And we have to remember that because systems of oppression, such as ableism and racism and transphobia and sexism, homophobia, classism, the list continues. That is not at all exhaustive. These systems shape our engagement, right? They shape the way that that we show up. No one is immune to them. I think that's particularly important. A metaphor that I return to often and reflect on often is the idea that white supremacy is not the shark, it's the air, it's the water. Or I also like to think it's the air that we're breathing, right? We're consuming it regularly. And so what does it mean if we reframe our perspective to understand that we are surrounded, we are immersed, we are merged, and therefore we are also participating? And so the presence of these systems, in this kind of complicated way, they both disrupt and secure. And that makes it incredibly difficult to challenge them, let alone dismantle them. Right? And when I say disrupt and secure, what I mean is they disrupt, they disrupt like the potential, like say, health of a community. They disrupt the potential joy and safety of a community or of people. But what it also does is it secures the status quo. It secures what we know. It secures those systems that are in place that we rely on, whether we know it or not, whether we choose to or not. And so it exists in this really kind of complicated way, like there's some tension between them. And because that tension exists, it's also why it's so hard to like challenge these systems. And, right now we're in a position, and not just now, but, since forever, we've been talking about dismantling. And for me, there's a question of like, what would that take? Right? What does that take if this is something that has been the way for so long? But the stakes have never been higher. And radical change requires radical risk. And so we have to be willing to ask ourselves and each other, what are we willing to sacrifice, to give up, to let go of? Because our complicity in these systems and structures make them possible, regardless of who we are, regardless of our story, regardless of how we got here. And that complicity makes the harm possible as well. And so obviously all of this is like way easier said than done. And I always also say that I always have way more questions than answers, which is sometimes frustrating, and I feel that. But I operate from a place of questioning, which also just opens up space. It opens up space for imagination and for dreaming. And those are things that colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism in particular don't want us to do. They don't want us to stop and dream, because if we dream, then we might just imagine something different. But I think it's so important that whenever we can, we invite that, and we think about that as a practice. And so these are some questions that I just want to offer to myself and to you and to those who will kind of listen to this recording afterwards. So a few questions for us to kind of just sit with and ponder. Who gets to be a survivor? Whose trauma counts? What is safety? What does a transformed world look like? Is it possible to have a world without harm or violence? What forms of violence and violation do we condone, whether in public or in private? What forms of violence and violation do we perpetuate, again, whether in public or in private? How does carceral culture help? And how does it hurt? What does accountability mean? Who and what are you accountable to? How do you understand and practice consent? With yourself, with others, with the land, with these systems, with the world? And finally, what does freedom look like? And what does it feel like? And so let's just sit with those easy questions for a moment. And know that these questions might feel complicated. If you have stuff happening in your belly right now or in your chest, in your throat, I just want you to be a witness to those feelings and sensations. And I think that the question should feel complicated because this is complicated, or at least it's complex. I know sometimes we don't like saying complicated, but it is complicated. It's not black and white, and our approach, which often enforces the binary of black and white or right and wrong, makes these questions feel extra complicated because they don't leave us as much space for, what I think are often easy or easier answers. But even if the questions are hard, we still need to ask them. And we need to learn how to dive into the unfamiliar territory of uncertainty and learn how to question and be okay with the answers that come up and with the answers that don't. And for me, these questions have been especially important because they invite me to push back against what I've been taught to be true or absolute or the way. They invite me to turn inwards and explore the parts of myself that I don't necessarily want to see or touch or know. And that is so important because I've learned that I can't actually serve others without first serving myself. I can't support others without first supporting myself. And this questioning process is part of that. In the same ways that I can't, I do it, but I shouldn't, question and judge others without doing the same to myself as well. And so I invite all of us, again, whether you are doing individual or organizational support, to engage in this process of reflection in an ongoing way. You have to come back to it. You have to return to it over and over again, by yourself and with others in your community, with your people. And we have to consistently question and reflect on how we care for each other and what people need to be well what people need to be safe, and ultimately what people need to be free.
Well, thank you so much, Shanice, for the 2 poems, for this amazing speech. I think this speech sets a precedent for the rest of the webinars throughout the month. So I think that, because this webinar is really opening the discussion, it's to inaugurate the series of webinars this month, and I think it's perfect. I think that the complex and complicated questions that you asked could be answered or explored throughout this month. So thank you so much. I wrote quickly some lines questioning the table about the Black Lives Matter uprising. It cannot happen overnight. White supremacy is the water, not the shark. It's amazing quotes, and hopefully, like, people can reimagine, and hopefully that people can reflect on what needs to change, but real change, and about dismantling. So thank you so much. So we'll head and start with the discussions. We ran a few minutes late, so we won't do all of the questions, but you were talking about what happened in 2020. In your speech, you were reflecting. So to say the least, 2020 was really a tumultuous year for all of us, with social unrest, with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter uprising this summer that is still ongoing, and the Me Too movement as well. With all of that, all of those, I feel like 2020 with the pandemic, it really put a lens on social issues that were already there. Looking back at the year and those events, how are, like, everything that happened in 2020, how is that related to survivors of sexual violence?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And again, opportunity to reflect. I think for me, 2020 was very much a year of both like awakening and revealing. And so many were awakened, and then so much was revealed. And I don't think, this could be wrong, but I don't think anything, of course, besides like the plague, I don't think anything really like new happened. Just what COVID resulted in was really revealing what had already been happening, what was invisibilized, and who had been invisibilized. And it brought, I think, both harm and hurt to the surface in a real and visceral way. For many people, and for, of course, those who, have been experiencing harm and hurt kind of pre, March 2020, let's say. And so I think it's just important there, just in terms of like having that reflection as like what actually did shift. And for me, like the landscape is so important there in terms of like what had been revealed kind of in this process. But then I think specifically about how, people's experiences of harm were either intensified or worsened. People were put into, positions where that also became like more possible because we lost access to so much. I'm just thinking about, for example, the increase of cases of domestic violence and child abuse, simply for the fact that people did not have the same capacity to like leave their home or leave the space where they were spending maybe a majority of time with someone who is abusing them if it's in the context of their home, right? And so again, these are the things that kind of become revealed but are not new, right? It's not as if like that violence was not happening again pre-2020, but our attention to it just shifted. And what I'm especially kind of interested in is like that attention piece. And this, of course, I think is exacerbated by our access to kind of technology which is like incredible in so many of the ways. Clearly, we are together here in this virtual context, but also means that our attention shifts like really quickly, right? And so I think about all of the conversations and the action and the work that has happened kind of in the past year that has received so much attention. And for me, I want to know, like, is it going to be sustainable? Because those people who have been harmed and those people who continue to be harmed and to hurt are still going to be there. And that's still going to be happening, you know, even if our attention dwindles. And so again, for me, that goes back to like that responsibility of caretaking and down to like basic caretaking, right? Like thinking about people's basic needs not being met.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's like another challenging tension, right? Like, how do we talk about, say, you know, support on one scale when people like still don't have food in their fridge and are scared about their lights being turned off and like don't have medicine and access to healthcare for themselves and their children. Like these are basic needs that again are still not being met while we're also attempting to kind of like envision these other kind of processes. So I don't know if I answered your question, but those were just like a lot of thoughts about 2020.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think that I think my colleagues can agree that the beginning of the lockdown back in March, we received more calls and more requests for survivors of sexual violence, and it just showed that they were either more at risk or just the state of the world, just what's happening, just caused more distress. So they needed to talk more and to reach out more and to find support. So I agree with you. Yeah, completely agree with you. Talking about, the title of the webinar is, I will go back to the title and each of my questions. So the title is Beyond Inclusion, Reframing Support for the Survivors. So before we talk about how to reframe it, I think it's important that I take the time to summarize what is the state of support for survivors. What is the state currently? How is it going? So I will try to I was trying to summarize it, and there's different angles to that. So there's the justice system, there's the psychosocial support, and there's what's happening in the community service, like as workers as well. So I think with the justice system is more rarely are there convictions. So we saw last month with the acquittals of Gilbert Rozon and Eric Salvaille. So more often than not, there's acquittals or there are not enough evidence. So thus the case gets closed and conviction rarely happens. And what happens in the justice system is the survivor has to retell their story over and over again, and they get victimized over and over again. And as well, we cannot deny that judges, jurors, and lawyers and police officers have prejudices and biases. So that's the angle of the justice system. I don't know. People can comment along, and if you agree or disagree, please comment along. And for the psychosocial support, I think that I'm interested in knowing if people agree with me, but we're struggling. We don't have enough funds to respond to the need of the survivors, and more people need support because since the last few years we talk more openly about sexual violence, about consent and stuff, so people feel a bit more comfortable and reaching out and needing help. But at the same time, we are struggling with the funds that we don't have. And what I've seen more related to adapting our services to the diversity of the survivors, the last few years as well, intersectional feminism is very, very, very popular in the NGO world. People are talking more about this theory and putting it, applying it in their work. So we see that people are starting to realize that the services are not necessarily adapted, they're not necessarily inclusive or accessible. So I would say that is the current state of the support for the survivors. So in your opinion, why do we need to reframe it? Like, why is there a need of reframing it, for reframing the support?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, my initial kind of thought is, you know, like change is something that should happen like regularly. And like that process of like revisiting and thinking about how we do things, what are our processes, what are our structures, what are the systems that we have in place? Like that should actually be part of our regular, practice. But it isn't. And so I think just kind of like on its own or at the end of it, like I can imagine there's like this resistance to even the thought of reframing, because that requires us to like do the what? Like this is how we've been doing it for 25 years, right? Or 5 years or a year or whatever it is, right? And so like that resistance to change is very much like a human experience, which I totally understand in myself, you know, personally and professionally. I navigate that tension often. But I think that's like an important starting point, is if we can, again, approach this work with humility, which means as the world changes, our approach should also be changing. Yeah. And so for me, that's just like an important starting point in terms of like, you know, what is it that we need to reframe, or why do we need to reframe? It's because things are changing all of the time, and we have to be adaptive. And we have to be adaptive because those systems of oppression are so adaptive, right? Like that's why they've been able to exist and actually strengthen, not weaken over centuries, right? It's because they adapt. Yeah. They conform in ways that make it sticky, right? And hard to kind of remove that residue. And so we have to stay on our toes in that way. And so for me, reframing is like an invitation to like pause, move back and be like, okay, what is it or who is it that we've forgotten?
Talking about, I don't want to cut you off, but talking about...
No, go cut me off.
Who is forgotten, I think what does reframing means, especially for vulnerable communities or marginalized communities such as Black folks, Indigenous folks, and LGBTQ folks. Or you said that, yeah, we have to change, things need to change. But particularly for those communities, why does reframing support is important?
Yeah, and I think, so for me, one thing that I think is important is that marginalized communities have forever known how to and have been forced to care for themselves and each other. And so for me, especially if you're thinking about like as the context of like an organization, it's like, what is my responsibility here to kind of support that work that's been happening, to support that care work that's been happening? And so when we talk about things being like survivor-led, or, you know, blank led, like led by the people who are being most impacted by whatever it is that we're talking about, that is because we are understanding that people know themselves best, right? They know what their needs are. And I think that trust is often lacking. And that happens particularly, I think, in an organizational context where we set up these hierarchies, again, going back to like that metaphor of the table, where it's like, you know, if you don't have a position around that table, then how could you possibly know? But in my opinion, no one knows more than the person who is living or holding that experience. And so for me, like that piece is really important, is there are very, very few things that, for example, an organization can do that's going to be like, quote unquote, new. But I think so often there is like this pressure and competition. And this also ties into things like funding, which is like a whole other conversation, right? To like create the new program or to create the new service, to create that new offering, often without actually checking in with the people who are attempting to be served by it. And often to like meet those funding restrictions, right? So our whole kind of like process is quite backwards in that way. And that's because, you know, the structures are set up. So an organization, in order for it to exist, has to get the funding. The funding is being granted by a particular body who has a particular set of rules or expectations in mind. And then somewhere along the line, like the people are there. And it's like our hope that they're going to be met, that their needs are going to be met. And so I think it's so important that we actually approach this from a position of, one, trusting that people have been doing this work longer than organizations have existed, and inviting people into that process, I think is so key. And I think that's like the thing that kind of gets tricky, right? So it's like, how do we invite people into that process in a way that is affirming, in a way that centers their needs and their experiences, that doesn't feel tokenistic? And sometimes it's going to, right? And so I think there's like that interesting tension between kind of figuring it out. But so much of it for me has to do with that actual hierarchy of like knowledge and of experience in terms of like who knows and who doesn't. And we often discredit the experience and knowledge of individuals and of people because it doesn't fit into our like frameworks of who we deem to be an expert.
Yeah, I agree with you. After working a few years in the community, NGOs, the community sector is oftentimes the needs, like the marginalized folks know what they need and what are they needs. And sometimes it's questioned by people who are not part of that community. So that happens. Like it's a bit paternalistic sometimes, I see.
For sure. And I think
sometimes it's written. There's tons of reports of what like LGBTQ folks need or their communities need, people with disabilities. And sometimes it's questioned or pushed to the side. Yeah.
And like those reports, are written, but then just like sit on a shelf or now in a Google Drive or whatever. But I think that's incredibly important. And for me, a key kind of like theme or something that makes that especially challenging is around class dynamics as well. And so a big part of my support work has been around securing and distributing cash to Black and or Indigenous people in the community. And I think it's been such a learning experience, specifically around like how class status or like access to resources like totally shapes how people show up and like what their needs are. And again, I think often for organizations or for people who are doing support work, we're often operating under the assumption that people have like their basic needs met. And as I said earlier, that's like really not the case. And so I think it's incredibly important as we're like coming up with this, innovative and creative and exciting programming, that we're also like thinking about these real needs that are not being met. And so, someone's not going to be able to show up to like that cool program that you have curated and organized if they are hungry and you're not serving food, if they have babies at home and you're not offering childcare, if they are deaf and you don't have interpreters on site. Right. And so I think it's really important to think about, like, again, what are those basic needs and essential needs that are not being met and that we're being overlooked, again, because we're assuming what the status quo is for everybody.
Yeah. As we continue on, I just wanted to let everyone know that we'll for us to have a time to discuss, we'll just do 10 to 15 minutes Q&A right at the end. As we talked about what happened in 2020 and what we saw, especially during the summer, was the Black Lives Matter uprising that is still ongoing. There are still some initiatives going on. And what was really amazing, to say the least, is that we started to have the conversation of defunding the police. So the discussion is more in the media. People are more discussing it now. So just for everyone, to give like a definition so everyone knows what defunding the police means. So defunding the police is divesting funds from the police departments and reallocated them to non-policing forms of public safety and community support, such as social services, youth services, housing, education, healthcare, and other community resources. So that is what defunding the police means. And my question is, how is defunding the police connected to the support of survivors of sexual violence?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, like, again, kind of going back to like origins and thinking about systems, right? And so we live in a society and a culture where the narrative that many of us have been taught and that has been shared to us is that police exist to protect, literally, like, to protect and to serve. And so, if we go back to that practice of questioning, like, so let's question that. Like, is that actually what's happening? And if so, who is being protected and who is being served becomes a really important question. And I think for me, like, that specific kind of demand or call, which, might feel new, but is not. Like, we're talking about decades and decades of activism and fighting in terms of like this call for defunding the police, which is, again, not a new kind of phenomenon. It's incredibly important that we understand the links of police or state or like government sanctioned violence, and then the experience, for example, that survivors feel, or that survivors experience on a regular basis, right? Like, there are connections there. They're not isolated. And so, as you mentioned, defunding the police, which means to reallocate the enormous amount of funding that goes towards the police services, which are not actually protecting the people, into programming and services that will actually meet some of those needs, and specifically some of those ones that I've been talking about as well, around people's like basic needs being met, or enabling people's basic needs to be met so that other things can be fulfilled. And so I think that's just like really important. But again, like, the resistance that comes up around defunding the police is because it's challenging that narrative of what we've always been taught, right? And I think it's so important that we, again, engage in that process of questioning. There's a really incredible collective called the Prisoner Correspondence Project, and they did like a poster series one year, and again, like a series of questions kind of in the style that I love. And one of the questions was, what would you know about criminals if it wasn't for TV? Mm-hmm. Right. And so, again, thinking about like how much of what we know or what we think we know is like informed by an external source, by media, not actually by our personal experience. Or another question, like, how many of us have committed a crime and just haven't been caught? Right. And so we end up creating these entire systems around these like false sense of like who is good and who is bad, who is deserving and who is not. And then the police state is in place to uphold that. And people are harmed in that process, including people who are incarcerated, who, again, like, that fits so easily into our binary of like good people and bad people. And so what we can then do is just say, if someone is bad, we're going to lock them up, and then we don't have to actually deal with them. But we're not actually addressing any of like the root problems that are often linking back to those same systems that are, again, impacting everybody. Mm-hmm. And so, it's a really intense time because we're having these complex and layered conversations that force us to question so much of what we've been taught, that force us to like reckon with our own experiences of either being on the receiving end of harm or on the doing end of harm. But again, I think it's so important that we still do it, right? That we still question, and that we fight for what is right.
Yeah, I agree with you. This summer we did have like some conversations at the West Island CALACS about defunding the police, and we really sat down and we really thought about like especially when we accompany survivors of sexual violence, like what is the role of the police officers? And I don't want to generalize, but often our experiences with police officers when we accompany survivors is negative. So we were like, with reallocated funds, which we are struggling with funds, a lot of community organizations, we were allowed to we were starting to imagine like with the money that we could have, like what we could do, how services we could offer. or just how, when we accompany a woman filing a complaint, just reimagine how would that be if we had the funds. Just trying to imagine just something else. And we did have that discussion during the summer of what's the impact of police officers when we accompany survivors.
Absolutely.
And
like the role as well of police.
Exactly.
I was like police people, but the role of police in regards to either, being frontline workers or intervening.
Yeah.
And again, I think another real issue, and this for me is like one of the reasons why I believe we need to defund the police, is because I think we've given the police way too much power and way too much responsibility. And there's like no way that, anyone can do kind of like all that they're tasked with, so to speak. And, to be clear, this is not me absolving or like condoning behavior, but there's like this really important piece about like what happens when you give all of this responsibility and power to people without actually thinking about like, what is it that people need? What is it that a community needs to be well? And I don't think that all of those resources should be handled by or should be facilitated by the police, especially when they're not receiving like the necessary adequate training or knowledge to be able to do that. But again, I don't think that this is just like an issue of, training and like workshops. Like this is really an issue of
the system itself.
Yeah. And like, what do we deem to be important in terms of like what it is that people need and what it is that people are experiencing and who is experiencing the harm as well.
Yeah.
Because it would be a radically different conversation. If we get down into like who is actually experiencing harm here and looking at those demographics.
Yeah. Still talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and what the discussion that it started in 2020. And when I think about the title of this webinar about beyond inclusion, reframing support for survivors, when I think about reframing support, I think about alternatives. This is like, for me, as reframe, we think about alternatives. And that brings me to talking about just starting the conversation with transformative justice. So I wanted to talk a bit about transformative justice with you. I can explain what transformative justice is for everyone. I think we have only 2 questions left, and then we'll do the Q&A. So I will read you the definition that I found. It's on the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, and the definition is from the writer, educator, community organizer Maya Mingus. So transformative justice is a political framework and approach for responding to violence, harm, and abuse. At its most basic, it seeks to respond to violence without creating more violence and or engaging in harm reduction to lessen the violence. So transformative justice aims to transform the condition that enable the harm at the same time as facilitating repair for the harm while cultivating accountability, healing, resilience, and safety for all. So ending sexual violence can only be possible if root causes such as misogyny, white supremacy, ableism, heterosexism, cissexism, poverty, and trauma are addressed. So it's important to know that the framework, the transformative justice framework, was created by communities more at risk of violence. So it's created by Black folk and Indigenous folk, sex workers. A lot of activists are marginalized folks, people with disabilities, trans communities, and they are survivors as well. So I just wanted to note that transformative justice really comes from people who are more at risk of violence. So my question is, how does reframing support for survivors opens the door for transformative justice?
Yeah, great question. And I would say, transformative justice, also like restorative justice are, not just words, but kind of frameworks that are becoming more and more widely used and spoken of. And I think that's important. And I also have like this resistance sometimes to things becoming buzzwords because they often like lose their meaning and impact. And so for me, I appreciate you kind of naming that legacy of where transformative justice comes from. And I think that's really important. And I think the key thing there, again, like linking back to, what I was saying earlier, it's coming out of, for me anyways, like my interpretation of transformative justice is about reimagining. It's about reframing. Yeah. It's about acknowledging that like the way things are currently set up, which is so rooted and centered in a system or a culture that is carceral, is not working and doesn't work and doesn't actually lead to change, which is why, transformative is the key word there, transform, to shift, to expand, to become, right? And so I think for me, that also kind of invites this opportunity to think about like, what are the models that we can be and should be tapping into in our process of thinking about how we want to do things differently or not, right? Because sometimes we're doing things quite well as well. And I want to like highlight the good. But I think that's like just really important in thinking about the fact that, people got to a point where they said like, actually, like, this is not working and it's not working for our people and we're continuing to be harmed and the harm is not going away. Right. In the same way, when you incarcerate someone, like the harm does not disappear. The trauma does not just disappear by the mere fact of someone being like, say, removed from a community. It doesn't disappear the harm or the trauma. And so I'm really interested in what are the shifts and actions that we can take that will actually allow us to like address the trauma, as Mia was saying, to like address those roots. Because at the root of it, we're talking about trauma. We're talking about those systems of oppression that like shape, again, how we engage with each other, how we hurt each other, whose needs are met and whose needs are not, and then what decisions are made as a result of that. And so these things are like really layered. And I think, again, the binary that we're used to, which is like good and bad, even dare I say, like, victim and perpetrator, really, it doesn't allow us to see that gray space in between, which I think is so important. And to talk about that gray space is not to condone violence. It's not to condone harm that's happened, but it is really critical, in my opinion, if we're interested in transforming the culture that surrounds it, right? If we don't want to look at things merely as isolated or individual incidents, but as connections to each other, right? That are replicating kind of like this larger system of harm that is surrounding us, like through these different systems. And so for me, like transformative justice is not the way, but it's a way. Yeah. It's a way forward. It's a way through. And I think it's important that we really do think about like, what is it that we want to transform? And that requires us to question, what is it that we're not okay with? And people are going to have all different kind of answers and experiences there. And that's okay. And I think we also need to like invite that into the room, which I don't think we always do a great job of. And that is not transformative, right? Because that transformation requires like that shift and that diversity of kind of experience and perspective in a way that's going to like lead to like real cultural and systemic change, as I was mentioning earlier. And so for me, the things are really, really linked. And I want us to imagine, what it would look like, again, to do things differently and to do things where we don't add or compound or cause more harm.
Then my lasting question, thank you so much for that answer. I think it's important to what you said. It's like, it's not the option, but it is an option that we should invite. And I really like that. So as a lasting question, before we do the little Q&A, sorry, we don't have a lot of time for the Q&A, but I really wanted to do the discussion. So So in a world, Shanice, a liberated world with unlimited funds, in your opinion, like what is your vision of support and what is your vision of justice? Like if you could imagine it, what would it look like?
That's a good question. I know I saw this question, but I'm still like, oh my God.
Yeah.
How do you know? And I think even like my own reaction to, this question that I saw written down, it just speaks volumes, where we're not actually ever able to really do
resistance.
that.
Yeah. We have our own resistance of reimagining.
Totally.
Reimagining. That's totally. Yeah, you're totally. So right. Yeah.
Because, what for me, again, like as I was saying, like that say ideal vision, like it also requires me to give up and to sacrifice, what I'm comfortable with and how I've been protected by systems that harm other people. And so I think that's the place that's like hard. And I think that's where the resistance comes up against. Because again, that question of like, what is it that we're willing to actually sacrifice so that we can all be free? And it has to be a collective process. And I don't necessarily believe that we will all get free at the same time or at the same moment. I don't think it will just be like, a switch flicks on and then all of a sudden, boom, freedom. But I do think that there's like this interesting thing about like, what is it that like I'm willing to give up for us to get there? And that like, I don't have an answer to. Like, that's like my own personal work and stuff that I have to like process. But for me, like just something that's coming to mind, a book that was really transformative for me personally that I read this summer was Pleasure Activism. Yeah, The Politics of Feeling Good by Aja Marie Brown. And that really, especially in the summer when I was dealing with a lot of like private and public grief, it was such a blessing to receive that offering from Aja Marie Brown and to really think about centering pleasure and joy in my life and offering that as an invitation to others. And so when I think about like a world that is just and a world that is free, there's one where people have access, access to like an abundance of pleasure and joy. And for me, like connected to that is, the safety and all of our needs are met, right? Because if we can be joyous and if we can just feel pleasure in all of the ways, then I think we're like on our way there. But yeah.
Beautiful lasting words. Thank you. Yeah, beautiful lasting words. Joy. Yes. Yes, please. I will stop. Well, thank you so much, Shanice Nicole, for this incredible keynote speech.